At a banquet in 1985 marking the 30th anniversary of the National Review, attended by Ronald Reagan, William F. Buckley, Jr., American thinker and founder of National Review, editor, gave a speech in which he celebrated the U.S. nuclear deterrent, and the U.S. president's willingness to use it. Buckley expressed his belief that these weapons and this preparation helped preserve American freedom during the Cold War era, so that future generations could look back and be grateful, because at nightfall, the blood of their fathers ran through their veins. Several decades later, after Reagan's death, Buckley wrote that he had changed his mind. He stated that he believed the defining moment had arrived, and that Reagan would not, in fact, have deployed our great bombs, no matter what the Soviet Union did. This anecdote matches the general evolution of perceptions toward the Reagan presidency. While in office, Reagan was loved or feared as a hawk. Today he is increasingly remembered as a peacemaker. It also exposes the deep uncertainty at the heart of every attempt to analyze and predict the use of nuclear weapons. For nearly 8 decades, the possibility of nuclear war has been linked to complex strategic calculations, relating to command and control systems, and subject to comprehensive war maneuvers. However, all analysis ultimately depends on unknown human factors, meaning if the terrible moment occurs, how will the human element make its decisive decision? This problem is worth thinking about, because the world may now be closer to using nuclear weapons than ever before, and how close that may be depends on the situation of the Russian president. On the one hand, it can be argued that Vladimir Putin's recent speech in which he announced a large-scale mobilization in his war against Ukraine pushed the nuclear danger away somewhat, because it obliged him to deepen the conventional conflict. Yet the nuclear threat in this conflict has always been associated with Russia's desperation, and Putin's move was undoubtedly one of desperation. This policy's profound unpopularity suggests that Putin's government will be more vulnerable internally than it has been during the war thus far, and promises no certainty of military success. At best, mobilization might help Russia hold on to its limited and very costly conquests. At worst, it would shove miserable conscripts into the furnace of a crumbling front. Putin's mobilization speech was clear in his promise that he would not simply allow complete collapse, even if it required the use of nuclear weapons. By announcing that referendums will be held in the occupied areas of Ukraine, Putin is essentially declaring that Russia intends to incorporate these areas into its own territory. By pledging to defend Russian lands by all means at our disposal, he is promising to defend new invasions, at least with tactical nuclear strikes. This creates an unusually perilous dynamic. Here we are not in a traditional state of equilibrium of terror, in which major nuclear powers threaten each other with a major response, and the greater danger here revolves around a miscalculation or a simple accident, similar to what has brought us close to the abyss several times in the past. Instead, we are facing today an active conflict and a hot war, in which a non-nuclear power is trying to win by relying on conventional forces, while the other side is trying to draw a red line. If crossed, nuclear weapons will be deployed, which means that if the war continues on its current course, if the Russian side finds itself besieged, it will face an immediate choice between the use of nuclear weapons or defeat. Perhaps the most similar situation to this scenario is from the Cold War era, when Fidel Castro sought Soviet nuclear weapons to defend his regime against invasion, and Douglas MacArthur requested permission to use nuclear weapons to prevent an outright defeat in the Korean War. Both cases are similar to the current case, in that the use of nuclear weapons was contemplated not in the context of an exchange of lethal nuclear strikes, but rather as a tactical intervention to prevent a conventional defeat. In this case, however, one plus is that the key decision-makers, Putin, and his inner circle, are under immediate threat, meaning that their hold on power and ultimately their lives by the possibility of Russia suffering a conventional defeat in the Ukraine war, more than the threat that the United States faced the prospect of defeat in Korea, or the threat faced by the Soviet Union by the prospect of Castro's overthrow. This does not mean that we should expect Putin to use nuclear weapons, and it is not clear from the Russian chain of command to what extent he can make this decision unilaterally, because the historical recklessness involved in such a decision would have consequences that could destroy the system. The possibility of escalation into a direct war with NATO, and subjected Russia to the complete abandonment of the remaining quasi-friends and the complete collapse of its economy. There is a reasonable enough bet that even in the face of defeat, Putin, or his regime, will hesitate to use nuclear weapons. However, one should not bet on a nuclear war, the way one would bet on other outcomes. Suppose there was a only 20% chance of breaking the nuclear taboo, that number would still be terrifying and not at all reassuring. And while Ukraine hawks in the West, who tend to downplay nuclear dangers for the time being, got many facts right about this war, one of the main things they were right was that Putin is more inclined to gamble on ideological motives than he is a statesman distinguished by his cold blue eyes. Now, what does that mean for the nuclear threat? Does not bode well. Therefore, I return to the point I have always made throughout this war, that American support for Ukraine is good and necessary, but there is a point at which Ukraine's goals and the interests of the United States may diverge, and the combination of Ukrainian military penetrations and Russian nuclear threats makes this point closer than before, the point which the Ukrainians would like to go to, while we need negotiation and restraint. Based on this understanding, Kiev might be willing to accept an extraordinary degree of nuclear risk.